I was in the waiting room when my daughter called. Mom, we're leaving for Europe tomorrow. I sold your beach house in your husband's truck. Then she hung up. 45 years raising her gone with one call. But grief taught me patience. 3 days before he died, Robert gave me an envelope. Inside were deeds, bank accounts, and one truth. I was never the poor widow she thought I was. She left thinking she took everything. What she didn't know was that I already owned the ground beneath her feet. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's get started. The waiting room at Rush University Medical Center smelled like disinfectant and old magazines. Antonia Brooks sat in chair 14, her weathered hands folded over a worn leather purse. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. They cast everything in pale winter light. She checked her watch. 2:15. Doctor, Martinez was running late again. But that was fine. At 71, she had learned patience. 6 months of widowhood had taught her many things. The chairs around her held the usual collection of Chicago's elderly. A man coughed into his sleeve. A woman flipped through People magazine. Someone's hearing aid squeaked. These sounds had become the background music of her life now. Antonia's phone rang. The ringtone was too loud. She fumbled for it, embarrassed. The caller ID showed Angela's name. Her daughter never called during work hours. I see, sweetheart. Mom, listen. We're flying to Europe tomorrow. I sold your beach house and Robert's truck. You'll get 30%. The words hit like ice water. Antonia's breath caught in her throat. The beach house in Michigan. Robert's red pickup truck. Sold. Without asking. Angela, the buyers wanted everything fast. Cash deal. You understand, right? We need this trip. Marcus got that promotion. The line went quiet. Antonia stared at the clinic's gray carpet. Her chest felt tight, but not from grief this time. Something else was rising inside her. Something cold and steady. Mom, you there? Mom. Her voice came out calm. Too calm. Have a good trip. Great. Thanks for understanding. Love you. The phone went silent. Antonia slipped it back into her purse. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Strange. They should be shaking. The beach house had been Robert's dream. He'd saved for 20 years to buy it. Fixed every broken board himself. The truck was his baby. A 1995 Ford F-150 with only 60,000 miles. He'd washed it every Sunday after church. Now they were gone. Sold for Angela's vacation. Antonia looked out the window. Chicago's winter sky pressed down gray and heavy. The parking lot stretched out below. Cars moved like toys in the distance. Everything looked smaller from up here. Less important. She thought about the neighbors back home. How they'd looked at her after the funeral. Poor Antonia. All alone now. They'd whispered about property taxes and Medicare copays. About fixed incomes and Lipitor costs. As if being widowed made her helpless. Not today, she whispered to herself. The words surprised her. They came from somewhere deep. Somewhere that hadn't spoken in months. Robert used to say that when things got tough. Not today. Not on my watch. A memory surfaced. 3 days before Robert died. He'd been in his recliner, too weak to get up. But his mind was sharp. It was always sharp until the very end. He'd handed her a manila envelope. Thick and heavy. Sealed with tape. Keep this safe, Tony. Don't open it unless you have to. But if Angela or Michael ever try to push you around, he'd squeezed her hand. Well, just remember what I taught you about standing up. She'd tucked the envelope away in their bedroom closet, behind the winter coats. She'd almost forgotten about it. Almost. The clinic's heat kicked on with a mechanical hum. Warm air circulated through the room. It carried the smell of coffee from the nurse's station. Someone laughed in the distance. Normal sounds. Normal life continuing. But something had shifted inside Antonia. The hurt was still there. The betrayal burned in her chest. But underneath it, something else was growing. Something that felt like Robert's stubborn streak. His quiet pride. She'd spent 6 months letting people take care of her. Letting them make decisions. Angela had been handling the bills. Michael had been checking on the house. Everyone treating her like she was made of glass. Maybe it was time to remind them who she used to be. Before Robert got sick. Before she became just another grieving widow on the South Side. She'd been a CTA route scheduler for 35 years. She'd managed buses and drivers across half of Chicago. She'd handled union disputes and budget cuts and politicians who thought they knew better. Robert used to joke that she could organize anything except their garage. The woman next to her sneezed. Antonia handed her a tissue from her purse. The woman smiled and said thank you. Such a simple exchange, but it reminded Antonia of something. She was still here, still capable of small kindnesses. The manila envelope waited at home. She could almost feel its weight in her hands. Robert had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone. Even in dying, he'd left her tools. She thought about Angela's voice on the phone. So casual, so certain that Mom would just go along with it. After all, what could a 71-year-old widow do? Who would listen to her? Thought made her smile. Just a little. Just enough. A speaker crackled overhead. Antonia Brooks. Antonia Brooks to room 3, please. She stood up slowly. Her knees protested, but they held. She smoothed down her coat and picked up her purse. The manila envelope would still be there when she got home, along with everything else Robert had taught her about not backing down. The receptionist waved her toward the hallway. Antonia walked past the other patients, past their tired faces and quiet conversations. Her spine felt straighter than it had in months. The game had begun. She just hadn't known she was playing until now. The number 9 Ashland bus rumbled south through Chicago's afternoon traffic. Antonia sat near the front, her purse clutched tight against her lap. The heater blew warm air that smelled like diesel and winter coats. Outside, the city scrolled past in shades of gray and brown. Her palms felt dry for the first time in months. Strange. Even during Robert's worst days in the hospital, her hands had been damp with worry. But now, riding home with Angela's words still echoing in her head, she felt oddly calm. The bus lurched to a stop at 79th Street. A young mother climbed aboard with 2 small children. The little girl had pigtails and bright red mittens. She reminded Antonia of Angela at that age, back when her daughter still asked permission before making big decisions. Antonia's reflection stared back from the window. 71 years old. Gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She looked like every other widow on the South Side. Harmless. Forgettable. Maybe that was her advantage. The bus turned on to Ashland Avenue. Strip malls and gas stations passed by. A few teenagers waited at the next stop, backpacks slung over their shoulders. School had let out. Another day ending. Another day of people making choices that affected other people. Antonia pulled the cord. The bell chimed softly. She gathered her coat and stood as the bus slowed. Her knees protested, but they held steady. Everything held steady today. Her house sat on a quiet block lined with bungalows. Small front yards. Chain-link fences. Cars parked bumper to bumper along the curb. Robert's driveway stood empty now. The space where his red truck used to sit looked like a missing tooth. She climbed the front steps slowly. The porch creaked under her weight. It needed new boards, but that could wait. Everything could wait except what was waiting in the bedroom closet. The house felt different when she stepped inside. Cooler. Dark. Quieter. As if it knew something important was about to happen. She hung her coat on the hook by the door and walked through the living room. Past Robert's empty recliner. Past the TV that stayed on the news channel because silence felt too heavy. The bedroom smelled like lavender and old wood. Antonia opened the closet and pushed aside her winter coats. Behind them, exactly where she'd left it, sat the manila envelope, thick and heavy in her hands. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. The afternoon light slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the yellow tablecloth. Her heart beat faster, but her hands stayed steady as she peeled back the tape. Inside were papers. Lots of papers. Property deeds, bank certificates, legal documents with official seals, and a letter in Robert's careful handwriting. She read the letter first. Tony, if you're reading this, then someone is trying to take advantage of you. I never told you everything about our finances because I didn't want you to worry. But I saved more than you know. We own 7 properties in Chicago. The beach house was just the beginning. 7 properties. Antonia set the letter down and picked up the deeds. One by one, she read through them. A duplex on the west side. A small apartment building in Lincoln Park. A commercial space in Wicker Park. And the mid-rise on the north side where Angela lived. Her hands began to shake. Just a little. Angela lived in one of their buildings. Had been paying rent to her own parents for 3 years. Rent that went directly into an account Antonia knew nothing about. She found the bank statements next. Robert Investments, Inc. The numbers made her dizzy. Deposits every month. Rent payments from tenants she'd never met. Property taxes paid automatically. A business she'd never known existed. At the bottom of the pile, she found the LLC documents. Robert's signature on the first page. And below it, her own signature. Notarized 2 years ago. She remembered signing it now. Robert had said it was for insurance purposes. Just a formality, Tony. Don't worry about it. But according to these papers, She was the sole member of Robert Investments Inc. Had been for 2 years, which meant Antonia reached for the phone. Her address book sat beside it, filled with Robert's careful notes. She found the number for Mr. Peterson on LaSalle Street. Robert had used him for the house deed when they'd bought this place 30 years ago. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered. Peterson and Associates. This is Antonia Brooks. I need to speak with Mr. Peterson. It's urgent. I'm sorry, Mrs. Brooks, but Mr. Peterson is in court today. Can I take a message? Antonia stared at the papers spread across her table. Bank statements and deeds and documents that changed everything she thought she knew about her life. Tell him Antonia Brooks called about Robert Investments. Tell him my daughter just sold property that might not have been hers to sell. The woman's voice sharpened with interest. I'll have him call you first thing tomorrow morning. Antonia hung up and leaned back in her chair. The kitchen felt smaller now, too warm. The papers seemed to pulse with importance in the afternoon light. She thought about Angela's phone call. How casual her daughter had sounded. You'll get 30%. As if she was being generous. As if the beach house belonged to her in the first place. But if these documents were real, if Robert had been building something bigger than she'd known, then Angela had just sold property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Property that legally belonged to Antonia through the LLC. The implications made her stomach turn. Had Angela known about the other properties? Had she been planning this for months? Years? Antonia pulled out a yellow legal pad from the kitchen drawer. Robert had always made lists when he was thinking through problems. She drew a line down the middle of the page. On the left side, she wrote, what I know. On the right side was, what I need to do. What I know, 7 properties. LLC in my name. Beach house sold without permission. Angela living in our building. What I need to do, call Peterson. Void the sale. Secure the titles. Freeze rent payments. The list grew longer as she thought. Each item led to 3 more questions. If Angela had forged documents to rush the sale, what else had she lied about? If there were 7 properties, why had Robert kept them secret? If she was the legal owner, why hadn't she been receiving rent payments? Her hands shook as she wrote. Not from fear this time. From something else. Something that felt like anger mixed with determination. She stood up and walked to the living room window. The street looked the same as always. Mrs. Chen watering her flowers next door. Mr. Jackson washing his car in the driveway across the street. Normal people living normal lives. But everything had changed in the space of an afternoon. She wasn't just a widow on a fixed income anymore. She was a property owner, a business owner, someone with assets and legal rights and reasons to fight back. The reflection in the window showed an older woman with gray hair and tired eyes. But behind the tiredness, something else was stirring. Something that remembered how to plan, how to organize, how to make lists and follow through. Robert had left her more than money. He'd left her weapons. She returned to the kitchen table and picked up the phone again. This time she dialed Angela's number. It went straight to voicemail. You've reached Angela Martinez. I'm probably traveling or in meetings. Leave a message. The beep sounded. Antonia took a deep breath. Angela, it's Mom. We need to talk when you get back from Europe. About the properties. All of them. She hung up and stared at the papers scattered across her table. 7 properties. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. An entire business built in shadows while she'd worried about grocery bills and Medicare copays. This isn't simple, she whispered to the empty kitchen. The words hung in the air like a promise. Or a threat. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening. Street lights began to flicker on. But inside Antonia's kitchen, under the warm yellow light, a different kind of planning was just beginning. The game Angela had started with her phone call was about to become much more complicated than either of them had expected. Peterson's office sat on the 15th floor of a granite building that smelled like old money and leather chairs. Antonia had taken the Brown Line downtown, then walked 3 blocks through Chicago's Loop. Her sensible shoes clicked against the marble lobby floor as she waited for the elevator. The receptionist had gray hair and kind eyes. She offered coffee, which Antonia declined. Her stomach felt too tight for caffeine. Too much was riding on what Mr. Peterson would tell her about the papers she'd brought in her purse. Mrs. Brooks? A tall man in his 60s appeared in the doorway. I'm Jim Peterson. Please come in. His office overlooked LaSalle Street. Through the windows, she could see people hurrying along the sidewalks below. Everyone was somewhere important to be. Everyone with problems that probably seemed huge to them. Peterson sat behind a desk covered with neat stacks of documents. He'd been studying her papers since she dropped them off yesterday morning. His expression was serious. Too serious. Mrs. "Brooks, we have a problem." She'd expected that, but hearing it out loud still made her chest tighten. "The sale of your beach house appears to be fraudulent. Your daughter used a power of attorney document that was never properly executed. She also claimed you were mentally incapacitated due to grief." The words hit like a slap. Mentally incapacitated, as if losing Robert had broken her brain along with her heart. "But that's not the worst part," Peterson continued. "We ran a title search on all 7 properties. Your son-in-law Edward has been using them as collateral for private loans. Loans he took out without your knowledge or consent." Antonia's hands gripped the arms of her chair. Edward, Angela's husband of 5 years. The man who'd insisted on managing their finances after Robert died. The man who'd convinced Angela that Mom was too fragile to handle business matters. "How much, wouldn't?" she asked. $300,000. Spread across 4 different lenders. The number hung in the air like smoke. $300,000 borrowed against properties she'd owned without knowing it. Money she'd never seen. Debts she'd never agreed to. Peterson pulled out another folder. "The bank that handled the beach house sale is getting nervous. They've flagged this as a UDAP risk. Unfair, deceptive, or abusive acts or practices. The title company is quietly panicking because they may have insured a fraudulent transaction." Through the window, a construction crane moved slowly against the gray sky, building something new, tearing down something old. The city was always changing. But some changes were planned. Others were just destruction. "What are my options?" Antonia asked. Peterson leaned forward. "You can file a criminal complaint immediately. Fraud, forgery, theft. We have enough evidence to make arrests. Or," he paused. The word "or" stretched between them like a bridge over dangerous water. "Or we can be strategic. File quiet rescission papers. Update the beneficial owner information with all the banks. Let them sweat while we gather more evidence. See how deep this goes." Antonia thought about Angela's voice on the phone. So casual. So certain that Mom would just accept whatever happened to her. And Edward, probably sitting in some European cafe right now, spending money stolen from properties his wife didn't even legally own. The hunger for justice burned in her chest. She wanted to see them arrested, wanted to watch them explain themselves to police officers and judges and juries, wanted everyone to know what they'd done to the widow who trusted them. But Robert's voice whispered in her memory. "Sometimes the best revenge is letting people think they're winning while you plan their downfall." "I want to be strategic," she said. Peterson nodded. "Smart choice. But it won't be easy. Your neighbors will see the papers being filed. Word gets around in small communities. They'll think you're just a confused old woman fighting with her children over money." She thought about Mrs. Chen next door, Mr. Jackson across the street, the other widows at church who already whispered about her finances behind their hymn books. Soon they'd have more to whisper about. "I can live with whisper," she said. Peterson spent the next hour explaining the legal process. Rescission papers to void the fraudulent sale. Updates to banking records to establish her true ownership. Quiet investigations into Edward's other business dealings. It would take months, maybe longer. When she finally left the office, the sun was setting over the city. The elevator carried her down through 15 floors of other people's legal problems. In the lobby, security guards checked IDs and signed in visitors. Everyone protecting something. Everyone worried about someone taking what wasn't theirs. She walked back to the Brown Line station as streetlights began to flicker on. The evening rush hour had started. Commuters hurried past her on the sidewalk, talking on phones, checking messages, living their busy lives. At the station, she bought a Tribune from the newsstand. The headlines were about politics and weather and sports. Normal problems for normal people. Nothing about widows discovering their children were thieves. The train arrived with a screech of brakes and a rush of warm air from the tunnels. She found a seat near the window and watched the city scroll past. Office buildings giving way to residential neighborhoods. People in their lit windows, cooking dinner, watching TV, arguing about homework and bills. Her phone buzzed. A text message from Angela. "Having amazing time in Paris. Hotel is incredible. Thanks for understanding about the house. Love you." Antonia stared at the message. "Thanks for understanding." As if she'd had a choice. As if selling someone else's property was just a family favor. She typed back, "Glad you're having fun? We'll talk when you get back." The train crossed the Chicago River. Below, tour boats moved slowly through the dark water, their lights reflecting like scattered coins. Tomorrow, Peterson would start filing papers. The banks would get nervous. Edward's lenders would start asking questions. But tonight, Angela was drinking wine in Paris, convinced she'd gotten away with it. The train pulled into her station. Antonia gathered her purse and walked down the platform. A few other passengers got off with her, but they disappeared quickly into the evening. Soon she was alone, walking the 3 blocks to her house. The neighborhood felt different now. Quieter. The whispers hadn't started yet, but they would. Soon everyone would know that the poor widow Brooks was causing trouble, fighting with her children over money, making life complicated for everyone. Her house sat dark and still at the end of the block. She climbed the front steps slowly, keys ready in her hand. Inside, the silence felt heavier than usual, but not empty, full of plans forming in the darkness. She hung her coat by the door and walked to the kitchen. The papers from Robert's envelope still sat on the table where she'd left them. 7 properties, hundreds of thousands of dollars, a business built in shadows while she'd worried about grocery bills. Through the kitchen window, she could see lights in the neighbors' houses. Mrs. Chen washing dishes at her sink. Mr. Jackson watching the late news in his living room. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that the quiet widow next door was about to turn her children's world upside down. Antonia sat down at the table and picked up her yellow legal pad. She added new items to her list. File rescission papers. Update beneficial owner records. Monitor Edward's lenders. The list grew longer as she thought, each step leading to the next. Each move calculated to tighten the net around Angela and Edward without them knowing it. Outside, the city hummed with its nighttime rhythm. Cars passing on distant streets. The L train rumbling toward the loop. A million people making a million choices, most of them small and forgettable. But some choices changed everything. Some choices were the beginning of war. Antonia looked at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. 71 years old. Gray hair and tired eyes in the face of someone people assumed they could ignore. She was counting on that assumption. It was going to be her greatest weapon. Angela's taxi pulled up to the north side mid-rise at 3 in the afternoon. The driver helped her with 2 suitcases that looked expensive but felt light. Too light, as if she'd left more behind in Europe than just clothes. She stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building where she'd lived for 3 years. The brick facade looked the same. The glass doors still gleamed in the autumn sun. But something felt different. Wrong. Carlos, the doorman, emerged from the lobby. His usual smile was missing. In his hand, he carried a manila envelope and a set of keys. "Miss Martinez," he said formally, "I need to return these to you." Angela stared at the keys. Her keys. The ones that opened the apartment she'd called home since marrying Edward. "I don't understand." Carlos shifted uncomfortably. He was a kind man who'd always asked about her mother, who'd accepted packages and watered plants when she traveled. Now he wouldn't meet her eyes. The building management sent new instructions. "I'm sorry." He handed her the envelope. Inside, she found an eviction notice. Clean white paper with official seals. 30 days to vacate. Signed by Robert Investments Inc. 40, her mother's company. The words blurred as she read them. Legal language about breach of lease terms. About unauthorized use of the property as collateral. About immediate termination of tenancy rights. "Where's Edward?" Carlos asked gently. Angela's throat felt tight. He had business to finish in London. It was a lie. Edward had disappeared from their Paris hotel 3 days ago. Left a note about needing space to think. Taken their joint credit cards and half their cash. The hotel manager had been very understanding when she'd explained about family emergencies. Less understanding when her remaining cards were declined. She'd sold her wedding ring to buy the plane ticket home. Carlos helped her carry the suitcases to the curb. She called a taxi and gave the driver her childhood address on the south side. The trip across the city felt like traveling backward through time. Skyscrapers giving way to neighborhoods. Wealth fading into working-class comfort. Her phone rang as the taxi crossed the bridge over the Chicago River. Mom's number. For a moment, Angela couldn't breathe. "Hello, Angela?" Her mother's voice sounded careful, controlled. "I heard you might be having some travel troubles." The words were so gentle, so unlike what Angela had expected. She'd been prepared for anger, for accusations, for the cold fury of a woman who discovered her daughter's betrayal. Instead, she heard concern, the same tone Mom had used when Angela was 16 and called from a party where things had gone wrong. "Mom," Angela's voice cracked. "Was I wrong about everything?" The silence stretched between them. Through the taxi window, Chicago scrolled past in autumn colors. Brown and gold and gray. Beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. "We'll talk when you get here," Mom said finally. The taxi pulled up to the small bungalow where Angela had grown up. The same chain-link fence. The same concrete steps. The same porch where she'd sat as a child, watching for Dad to come home from work. Her mother appeared in the doorway before Angela had finished paying the driver. 71 years old but standing straight, gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. The same sensible shoes and careful posture. But her eyes were different, sharper, as if losing Robert had burned away something soft and left something harder behind. "Come in," Mom said simply. The house smelled like coffee and laundry detergent. The same smells from Angela's childhood. Safe smells. Home smells. She set her suitcases by the door and followed her mother to the kitchen. The yellow tablecloth was gone. In its place sat stacks of papers, legal documents, bank statements, property deeds, the evidence of everything Angela had tried to hide. "Sit down," Mom said. Angela sat at the same table where she'd done homework 30 years ago, where she'd told her parents about getting married, where she'd announced that Edward would handle their finances from now on because Mom was too fragile to deal with business matters. The irony tasted bitter in her mouth. "Can I stay?" she asked. "Just for a while until I figure things out?" Mom poured 2 cups of coffee. Her hands didn't shake. They hadn't shaken since Angela had called from the clinic 3 weeks ago. "This is still your home," Mom said. "It always has been." The kindness in her voice broke something inside Angela. All the arrogance drained away. All the certainty that she'd known what was best for everyone. All the anger at having a mother who didn't understand modern financial planning. "I'm sorry," Angela whispered. The words felt too small for what she'd done. Too simple for the damage she'd caused. But they were all she had. Mom sat down across from her. The papers between them represented hundreds of thousands of dollars. Properties Angela had never known existed. A business empire built while she'd worried about her mother's grocery bills. "Edward's gone," Angela said. "Left me in Paris with nothing. The credit cards, the bank accounts. Everything was in his name." She thought about the hotel room, about explaining to the concierge that her husband had taken all their money, about calling airlines to beg for emergency travel assistance, about selling her wedding ring to a pawn shop near the Eiffel Tower. "I thought I was protecting you," she continued. "After Dad died, you seemed so lost, so unable to handle things." Edward said families had to make hard choices sometimes. Mom's face didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, something sadder. Something that looked like disappointment mixed with love. "Edward was using our properties as collateral," Mom said quietly. $300,000 in loans. The beach house sale was just the beginning. Angela felt sick. The coffee tasted like metal in her mouth. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear I didn't know about the other properties. Edward handled everything. He said you'd sign papers." "I did sign papers," Mom admitted. "Your father had me sign LLC documents 2 years ago. Said it was for insurance purposes. I trusted him, just like you trusted Edward." The parallel hung between them. 2 women who'd believed the men they loved. 2 women who discovered that trust could be used as a weapon. "What happens now?" Angela asked. Mom stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into evening. Porch lights coming on. The smell of dinner cooking in distant kitchens. "Now you live here while you figure out your next step," Mom said. "You get a job. You rebuild your credit. You learn to make decisions for yourself instead of letting men make them for you." Angela nodded. The plan sounded simple. Terrifying, but simple. "There will be rules," Mom continued. "No men staying overnight. No borrowing money you can't pay back. No lying about where you've been or what you're doing." "I understand. Do you?" Mom turned from the window. "Because this isn't charity. This is family. And family means honesty, even when it hurts." That night, Angela unpacked her suitcases in her old bedroom. The same twin bed. The same desk by the window. The same closet where she'd hidden diary entries about boys and dreams and plans to escape to the big city. Now the big city had chewed her up and spit her back where she'd started. She lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear her mother moving around the house, turning off lights, checking the front door lock. The same nightly routine from 30 years ago. But there was something else. A sound Angela almost didn't recognize at first. Crying. Soft, muffled sobs coming from the hallway outside her door. Angela pressed her face against the pillow to muffle her own tears. Her mother was crying for the daughter who'd betrayed her, for the man who'd abandoned them both, for the trust that had been broken and might never fully heal. But she was also crying from relief. Her child was home. Hurt and humbled, but home. In the hallway, Antonia leaned against the wall outside Angela's door. Her shoulders shook with silent tears, not tears of weakness. Tears of a mother who'd chosen love over vengeance, who'd opened her door to the child who tried to steal her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, lawyers and bank officials and neighbors who'd whisper about the family drama. Angela would need to find work, to face the wreckage of her marriage, to learn how to live as herself instead of as someone's wife or daughter. But tonight they were both home, both safe, both learning that sometimes the hardest choice was also the right choice. Antonia wiped her eyes and walked to her own bedroom. In the mirror above her dresser, she saw a woman who'd aged years in the space of weeks. Gray hair and tired eyes and lines that hadn't been there before the Robert died. But underneath the exhaustion, something else looked back at her. Something that remembered how to fight, how to protect what mattered, how to love with boundaries instead of blind trust. The steel had always been there. It had just taken losing everything to find it again. The worn brown recliner still held Robert's shape. Antonia sat on the edge of it, feeling the familiar dips and curves where her husband had spent 30 years reading the Sun-Times. His pencil marks still decorated the margins of old newspapers. Stock prices circled, sports scores underlined. She remembered Sunday mornings. Robert in this chair with coffee and crossword puzzles. The smell of bacon drifting from the kitchen. Angela as a little girl, curled up on his lap while he explained compound interest using bus tokens from his CTA uniform. See this, Angela? Put away 1 token every day. In a year, you have enough for a week of rides. But if you spend tomorrow's tokens today, you walk. Simple lessons. Patient teaching. Robert never raised his voice when money got tight. Never made their daughter feel poor, even when they were. Antonia pulled out his letter again. The one from the manila envelope. Her eyes found the paragraph she'd read dozens of times already. If Angela ever gets in trouble with money, don't just bail her out. Make her earn respect, not allowance. She's got your brains and my stubborn streak. She just needs to remember how to use them. The words felt heavier now. Angela was upstairs, probably staring at the ceiling of her childhood room, probably wondering how her life had collapsed so completely. But her tears last night had been different. Not tears of self-pity, tears of recognition, of seeing herself clearly for the first time in years. Antonia stood and walked to the kitchen window. The morning sun slanted through the glass, warming her face. 2 blocks away, the L train rumbled toward downtown. People heading to work, to jobs that paid honest wages for honest effort. She thought about the beach house in Michigan, the one Angela had sold without permission. Peterson's legal team had voided the sale, but the house sat empty now, waiting. An hour later, she was driving north on I-94 in her old Honda. The car wheezed slightly on the hills, but it held steady. Like everything else Robert had maintained. Built to last, not to impress. The beach house sat on a bluff overlooking Lake Michigan. White clapboard siding, red shutters. A front porch where Robert used to sit with his evening beer, watching the sunset paint the water gold. She'd driven here to think. To remember why Robert had bought this place, not as an investment, as a retreat. A place where family could come together without the noise of the city. The key still turned easily in the front door. Inside, dust motes danced in the afternoon light. The furniture stood covered in white sheets like ghosts of summer vacations past. But the house felt alive, waiting for voices and laughter to fill it again. On the kitchen counter, she found another note. Robert's handwriting on a piece of scrap paper tucked behind the coffee maker. Bank Box 247, First National of South Haven. Key taped under my workbench. The workbench stood in the garage, covered with Robert's tools. She found the key exactly where he'd said it would be. Small and silver, attached to a tag with the bank's address. First National sat on the main street of South Haven, a brick building that smelled like old leather and careful decisions. The clerk led her to the vault, where rows of safety deposit boxes lined the walls like tiny steel apartments. Box 247 contained surprises. Her grandmother's pearl necklace, Robert's father's pocket watch, a collection of silver dollars dating back to the 1920s, and jewelry she'd never seen before. Art Deco brooches, vintage rings, a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the vault's fluorescent light and threw rainbows across the walls. The appraisal certificate at the bottom of the box estimated the collection's value at $40,000. Enough to solve Angela's immediate problems. Enough to pay for a fresh start anywhere she wanted. But Robert's voice whispered in her memory. Make her earn respect, not allowance. Antonia closed the box and returned the key to the clerk. The jewelry would wait. Like everything else, it would wait until Angela proved she understood the difference between rescue and enabling. On the drive home, she sketched plans in her mind. A ladder of lessons. First, a roof over Angela's head. Check. Second, honest work that paid honest wages. Third, the legal freedom that came from facing consequences instead of running from them. The beach house could be Angela's someday, but not as a gift, as something earned through years of better choices. The jewelry could fund a new business or a return to school. But only after Angela learned to value work over shortcuts. Lake Michigan stretched blue and endless in her rearview mirror. The water smelled like second chances, like the possibility of redemption for those willing to do the work. Back in Chicago, she parked in the driveway where Robert's truck used to sit. Angela's rental car occupied the space now, a practical sedan instead of the luxury SUV Edward had convinced her she needed. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Inside the house, Angela sat at the kitchen table with a laptop and a stack of papers. Job applications. Her face looked younger without makeup. More like the girl who'd once sat in Robert's chair learning about bus tokens and compound interest. Any luck? Antonia asked. 3 interviews next week. Administrative work mostly. It's not what I studied for, but it's a start. Antonia nodded and put the kettle on for tea. Through the window, the neighborhood looked the same as always, but everything felt different. Charged with possibility. The lesson was beginning to land. Now came the harder part. Watching Angela climb the ladder rung by rung without offering to carry her to the top. The conference room at Peterson and Associates smelled like leather briefcases and strong coffee. Antonia sat across from Angela at a polished mahogany table that reflected the autumn light streaming through tall windows. Between them lay stacks of documents that would change everything. Peterson entered carrying a thick manila folder. His expression was serious but satisfied. The look of a lawyer who'd spent weeks building an airtight case. The rescission is complete, he announced, setting the folder on the table. The beach house sale has been legally voided. All titles are clean. Angela's face went pale. She'd been quiet during the ride downtown, clutching a cup of coffee like a lifeline. The past 3 weeks of job interviews and applications had worn her down. Dark circles under her eyes. Clothes that hung loose from stress and poor eating. But there's more, Peterson continued. He opened the folder and spread documents across the table like evidence at a trial. We found some interesting information about your husband. Bank records, phone logs, handwriting analysis reports. Each page told part of a story that grew uglier with every detail. Edward forged your signature on 6 different loan applications, Peterson explained to Angela. He also attempted to marry a French national in Paris while still legally married to you. Bigamy charges are pending. Angela stared at the papers. Her hands trembled as she picked up a copy of her own signature. Except it wasn't her signature. Close, but not quite right. The A in Angela was wrong. Too sharp. Too confident. He practiced, she whispered. I found pages of my name written over and over in his hotel room trash. I thought he was being romantic. Antonia watched her daughter's face crumble. But this time, the tears weren't for herself. They were for the realization of how completely she'd been used. Peterson pulled out another document. A marriage certificate from a chapel in Montmartre. Edward's name at the top. Below it, the name Marie Dubois. Date stamped 3 days before he disappeared from their hotel. The French authorities are very interested in speaking with him, Peterson said. Fraud. Identity theft. Immigration violations. He's looking at deportation and 5 years in prison. Angela pushed the papers away. I can't look at anymore. But Antonia leaned forward. She'd been quiet through Peterson's presentation, letting the evidence speak for itself. Now it was time for the lesson to land. There's something else you need to see, she said quietly. She reached into her purse and pulled out a different folder. This one was older, worn at the edges, filled with documents Angela had never seen before. Property deeds, all 7 of them, each one bearing Antonia's signature as the legal owner. Each one dated years before Angela had even met Edward. The north side apartment where you lived, Antonia said, pointing to the first deed. I bought it in 2019. The rent you paid went into an account I never touched. Angela's eyes widened. You owned my apartment? I own 7 properties in Chicago. Your father left me a business worth over $1 million. I could have paid your bills on day 1, but you needed day 90. The words hit like cold water. Angela stared at the deeds spread across the table. Properties worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Businesses she'd never heard of. A fortune hidden in plain sight while she'd worried about her mother's grocery bills. You let me think you were poor, Angela said slowly. I let you think what you wanted to think, Antonia corrected. Because thinking I was helpless made it easier for you to take control. The room fell silent except for the hum of the building's heating system. Through the windows, Chicago stretched out in all directions. A city of millions, all thinking they understood their own stories. Peterson gathered the documents and returned them to their folders. The fraud charges will clear your credit within 6 months. The property loans are being transferred back to Robert Investments. And Edward, he shrugged. Edward's problems are just beginning. Angela sat back in her chair. The past 3 weeks replayed in her mind. The job interviews, the careful budgeting, the nights lying awake wondering how she'd rebuild her life from nothing. But it hadn't been nothing. It had been everything. She'd discovered who she was when the safety nets were gone. When the luxury car and expensive apartment and husband with connections couldn't define her anymore. "You could have told me," she said to her mother. "You could have saved me weeks of humiliation." Antonia's expression softened but didn't break. "Would you have learned anything from being rescued? Would you have looked for work? Would you have faced what Edward really was?" The questions hung in the air like smoke. Angela thought about the administrative job she'd accepted at a law firm downtown. $40,000 a year. Benefits after 90 days. A supervisor named Janet who'd called her references and asked tough questions about her work history. She'd been proud when they'd offered her the position. Proud of something she'd earned through interviews and qualifications. Not through connections or charm. "The job," she said slowly. "I don't have to take it now. I could do something else. Travel. Go back to school." "You could," Antonia agreed. "But will you?" Angela looked at her mother across the conference table. 71 years old and sitting straighter than Angela had seen her in months. Gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Sensible shoes and careful posture. But her eyes held something that hadn't been there before Robert died. Strength. Clarity. The kind of quiet power that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were worth. "I'm taking the job," Angela said finally. "I'm keeping the apartment at your house. I'm going to pay rent." Antonia smiled for the first time since they'd sat down. "Market rate?" "Market rate." Peterson began packing his briefcase. His work here was finished. The legal machinery would continue grinding through Edward's crimes, but the family business was settled. Mother and daughter walked to the elevator together. The afternoon sun slanted through the lobby windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Outside, Chicago hummed with its usual energy. Traffic and construction, and the sound of people building their lives one choice at a time. In the elevator, Angela finally spoke. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For thinking you couldn't take care of yourself. For letting Edward make decisions about your property. For being so arrogant." Antonia reached over and took her daughter's hand. The gesture was simple, but carried the weight of forgiveness that had been 3 weeks in the making. "We both learned something," she said quietly. "You learned what you're capable of when you have to be. I learned what I'm capable of when I refuse to be helpless." The elevator opened onto the lobby. They walked out together into the noise and light of the city. Two women who'd found new ground to stand on. Not the same ground they'd shared before Robert died. Something different. Something built on truth instead of assumption. Behind them in the conference room they'd left, the afternoon light fell across an empty table. No more documents. No more evidence. No more secrets. Just the quiet satisfaction of a lesson learned and a family beginning to heal. Angela's alarm buzzed at 6:30 on Monday morning. She'd been working at Palmer & Associates for 6 weeks now. Administrative coordinator. $42,000 a year plus benefits. The kind of steady job that paid bills and built character one day at a time. She could have quit after learning about her mother's properties. Could have traveled or gone back to school or simply lived off family money. But something had shifted during those weeks of job hunting. Something that made the work feel necessary. The law firm occupied 3 floors of a building near the Chicago River. Her desk sat by a window overlooking the water. She filed depositions and scheduled meetings and answered phones with a professionalism that surprised her supervisors and herself. At lunch, she walked to the nearby deli where other office workers grabbed sandwiches and coffee. Normal people living normal lives. She was becoming one of them. It felt strange and satisfying at the same time. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Dinner at 6, made your favorite pot roast." The messages had been simple since the conference room revelation. No drama, no emotional manipulation, just practical information and small kindnesses. The way adults communicated with other adults. Angela texted back, "I'll bring salad and wine." She'd been paying $400 a month in rent since moving back home. Market rate for a furnished room in that neighborhood. The money went into a household fund that covered utilities and groceries. Shared responsibility instead of charity. The arrangement had surprised the neighbors. Mrs. Chen next door had expected drama, shouting matches, police calls. Instead, she saw 2 women sharing lawn mowing duties and taking turns bringing in each other's mail. Very mature, Mrs. Chen had told Aurora Jackson from across the street. Not like those families on TV. Aurora had become an unexpected ally. She'd known Robert for 20 years. Had watched him wash his red truck every Sunday after church. had seen Antonia's quiet strength long before anyone else noticed. That woman's got steel in her spine, Aurora told anyone who'd listen. Always has. You just had to know where to look. The gossip had died down after the first month. Southside neighborhoods had bigger problems than family financial drama. And Angela's presence on weekday mornings, walking to the bus stop in professional clothes, sent its own message about stability and responsibility. At Peterson's office, the legal housekeeping continued quietly. Edward's debts were being transferred away from the properties. The fraudulent loans voided. Credit reports scrubbed clean of his criminal activity. He's facing extradition to France, Peterson had told them last week. The bigamy charges are just the beginning. Wire fraud, identity theft. The French take financial crimes very seriously. Angela felt nothing when she heard the updates. No satisfaction, no anger. Just the hollow relief of a problem removing itself from her life. The eviction notice that had humiliated her at the North Side building had been quietly withdrawn. A new lease issued under her own name, but she'd chosen not to move back. The small bedroom in her mother's house felt more honest somehow, more connected to who she was becoming. On Friday evening, she stopped by Mrs. Johnson's house 3 blocks away. Letitia Johnson was a single mother with 2 young children. She worked double shifts at the hospital and struggled with daycare costs. Here's this month's contribution, Angela said, handing over an envelope with $300. For Emma's preschool fund. Mrs. Johnson's eyes filled with tears. You don't have to do this. I know. I want to. The money came from Angela's salary, not from family wealth or guilt payments, from 40 hours a week of earned income that she could choose to share or keep. The choice made all the difference. At home, she found her mother in the garage. Antonia stood beside a familiar red pickup truck, running her hand along the fender like she was greeting an old friend. Robert's truck, Antonia said simply. Peterson got it back from the impound lot. The police released it after the fraud investigation. The truck looked smaller than Angela remembered. More worn, but clean and well-maintained, like everything else Robert had touched. Needs a wash, Antonia continued. Sunday tradition. Angela nodded. She remembered those Sunday afternoons. Robert with the garden hose and soap bucket, the radio playing oldies while he scrubbed chrome and checked tire pressure. The careful pride he took in maintaining what was his. I could help, she offered. I'd like that. They walked back into the house together. The kitchen smelled like pot roast and herbs. Comfort food that required hours of attention. The kind of cooking that said someone was worth the time and effort. Over dinner, they talked about practical things. Angela's work schedule. Antonia's doctor appointments. Plans for winterizing the house before the cold weather arrived. Normal conversation between adults sharing a household. But underneath the ordinary topics, something deeper had settled into place. A new understanding of boundaries and respect. Of how family could function when guilt and obligation were replaced by choice and mutual benefit. The beach house, Antonia said as they cleared the dishes. I've been thinking about renting it out. Seasonal tenants. Good income property. Angela dried a plate slowly. That makes sense. It's too valuable to sit empty. Unless you wanted to use it sometime. Vacation. Weekend getaway. The offer hung in the air without pressure. A possibility, not an expectation. Maybe next summer, Angela said. After I've been at the job a full year, earn some vacation time. Antonia smiled and nodded. The timeline sounded right, reasonable, built on achievement rather than entitlement. That night, Angela sat at her childhood desk paying bills. Rent to her mother, student loan payments, car insurance, the mundane arithmetic of adult responsibility. She thought about Edward, probably sitting in a French jail cell by now, facing consequences he'd spent years avoiding. The man who'd convinced her that shortcuts were smarter than hard work, that taking advantage of family was just good business sense. The shame of those beliefs had cooled into something more useful. Humility mixed with determination. The knowledge that she'd been wrong about almost everything, but that being wrong wasn't permanent. It was just a starting point for getting better. Through her bedroom window, she could see lights in the neighbors' houses, Mrs. Chen reading in her living room, Aurora's grandchildren playing video games in the basement. The quiet rhythm of a neighborhood where people knew each other's names and looked out for each other's property. Angela had lived here as a child, left as soon as she could. Thought she'd graduated to something better in the expensive apartment with the doorman and the marble lobby. Now she was back, but not as the same person. She was earning her place instead of assuming it, paying her way instead of being rescued, contributing to the community instead of just taking from it. The transformation felt more significant than any promotion or luxury purchase ever had. More real than the European vacation that had ended in abandonment and fraud. Outside, the city hummed with its nighttime energy. But inside the small bungalow, two women had found a new way to be family. Built on truth instead of assumption. On respect instead of manipulation. On love that came with boundaries instead of obligations. The sadness of losing Robert still lingered in the house. Probably always would. But the bitterness of betrayal had faded into something more manageable. Grief without anger. Memory without resentment. Angela turned off her desk lamp and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring another day of earned wages and chosen responsibilities. Another day of building a life that belonged to her because she'd worked for it. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd learned to want. The beach house looked different with cars parked in the driveway. 3 women had arrived that week through the referral network Antonia had spent 6 months building. Safe harbor for those escaping situations where money had been used as chains. The 501c3 paperwork sat in neat stacks on Robert's old desk. Articles of incorporation, tax exemption letters, partnership agreements with domestic violence organizations across Michigan. What had started as an empty house was becoming something larger. Angela climbed the front steps carrying grocery bags and textbooks. Social work classes at UIC had started 3 weeks ago. She'd paid the first semester herself with money saved from 9 months of steady employment. The student loan applications were filed, but she wanted to prove she could handle the financial responsibility before accepting help. How were classes today? Antonia asked from the kitchen. Hard. Good hard, though. Namanana wardan, tu. Angela set her books on the counter next to case management files. She was learning theory while Antonia handled the practical work of running a transitional housing program. Different approaches to the same goal. Helping people rebuild their lives after trust had been weaponized against them. The late afternoon sun streamed through windows that had been empty for months. Now they framed pictures drawn by children. Crayon flowers and stick figure families. Art created by kids who were learning what safety felt like. Antonia poured 2 mugs of coffee and walked toward the porch. Angela followed, carrying her organizational behavior textbook. She had an exam next week on group dynamics and leadership styles. Academic concepts that were becoming real through daily experience. The porch overlooked Lake Michigan. Robert had built it himself. Board by board, during the summer Angela turned 16. She'd helped hold the measuring tape while he calculated angles. Learned that good work required patience and precision. A small brass plaque now hung beside the door. Robert's porch for second chances. The engraving was simple, dignified, the kind of memorial that honored memory through service rather than sentiment. They sat in wooden chairs that faced the water. The late October wind carried the smell of changing seasons. Leaves turning, winter approaching, the cycle of endings that led to new beginnings. Sarah's interview went well, Antonia said, referring to one of their current residents. The bank offered her a teller position. Full-time. Benefits. Angela nodded and sipped her coffee. Sarah had arrived 2 months ago with nothing but the clothes she wore and a restraint order against her ex-husband. Now she was working toward financial independence. Small steps that led to larger freedoms. The foundation board wants to expand, Antonia continued. 2 more houses, one in Indiana, another near Grand Rapids. The growth represented success, but also complexity. More women helped, but more responsibility to manage. More lives depending on systems working correctly. Angela thought about her textbook chapters on organizational sustainability, about how good intentions needed strong structures to survive, about the difference between charity and empowerment. We'll need professional staff, she said. Trained counselors, case managers. Agreed. Which means fundraising, board development, all the things your father would have hated. They both smiled at that. Robert had been generous but private. He'd helped the neighbors quietly, fixed things without being asked, believed in action over announcements. But this work required visibility. Donors needed stories. Grants required reports. Public awareness campaigns generated the resources that kept doors open and lights on. A seagull landed on the porch railing. It studied them for a moment, then flew off toward the water. The lake stretched blue and endless toward the horizon, unchanged despite all the human drama playing out along its shores. I've been thinking about Edward, Angela said quietly. Antonia waited. They'd learned to let difficult topics develop naturally instead of rushing toward resolution. Not missing him, Angela clarified. Just understanding him better. How someone becomes that way. Edward was serving 18 months in federal prison now. Wire fraud, identity theft. The French charges had been dropped in exchange for his guilty plea in the United States. He would be deported after serving his sentence. Fear, Antonia said simply. Fear makes people do terrible things to avoid feeling powerless. The observation came from months of listening to women's stories, patterns that repeated across different backgrounds and circumstances. How economic abuse worked, how trust could be manipulated, how isolation made people vulnerable to exploitation. Angela pulled her jacket closer against the wind. I was afraid too. After Dad died. Afraid you couldn't handle things. Afraid I'd have to be responsible for everything. So you let Edward take control. I asked him to take control because I thought that was easier than learning how to do it myself. The admission hung in the air like the smell of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Truth that had taken months to recognize. Responsibility that had to be claimed before healing could begin. Inside the house, someone was cooking dinner. The smell of garlic and herbs drifted through the screen door. One of the residents was teaching her daughter to make spaghetti sauce, passing down skills that meant survival and connection. True love teaches what hurts to learn, Antonia said softly. The words weren't original. She'd heard them from a counselor at the Domestic Violence Center, but they'd stuck because they explained something important about the past year. Robert's love had taught her to be stronger than she'd known. Angela's betrayal had taught her to trust carefully. The women who stayed in this house were teaching each other that dignity didn't depend on money. That respect couldn't be bought or sold. Angela opened her textbook and read for an hour while Antonia answered emails on her phone. Mother and daughter working side by side. Different projects but shared purpose. The comfortable silence of people who'd learned to be themselves in each other's presence. As the sun set over the water, they gathered their things and walked inside. Dinner was ready. 7 people around a table that had once seated only Robert and Antonia during their summer vacations. The conversation mixed languages and life experiences. A teacher from El Salvador, a nurse from Detroit, a college student from Grand Rapids. Women rebuilding their lives one day at a time, sharing meals and responsibilities in the slow work of healing. After dinner, Angela helped with homework, while Antonia reviewed the next day's schedule. Case management appointments, job interviews, a trip to the courthouse for a custody hearing. The work never stopped, but it felt sustainable now. Built on systems instead of heroics, funded by donations instead of guilt, staffed by professionals instead of volunteers, overwhelmed by the scope of need. Outside, the lake whispered against the shore, waves that had been moving for thousands of years. Constant motion that wore down hard edges and revealed what remained when everything else was stripped away. Angela looked at her reflection in the kitchen window. 29 years old, student, case management volunteer, daughter who'd learned the difference between helping and enabling. Behind her reflection, she could see her mother organizing files for tomorrow's meetings. 72 years old, foundation director, widow who discovered that grief could become wisdom if you let it teach instead of destroy. They'd both been broken by the events of the past year, but broken in ways that let light through, in ways that made them more useful to people who needed what they'd learned through loss. The beach house would never be the same as when Robert was alive. It couldn't be, but it had become something he would have recognized. A place where work mattered, where people helped each other without keeping score, where second chances were earned through effort, not given through pity. Forgiveness, they'd discovered, was daily work. Not a moment of revelation, but a practice that had to be chosen again and again. Some days were easier than others. But tonight, as the house settled into quiet and the lake sang its ancient song, both women felt something that had been missing for a long time. Peace,